internet, and welcome to my video about the top 5 American Civil War generals, North and South. Yes, this is actually going to be perhaps a bit controversial because it is actually going to be a ranked video, not just my I like these people or I like these people. I'm actually gonna rank my top 5 Civil War generals, South and North, actually, because I'm going to start with the Southern generals, because they lost. I don't know why. I'm going to start with the Southern generals. When I return later, I will probably do a apology to a certain degree and name drop a few of those commanders that I still feel is very, very skilled and worthy of inclusion, but just didn't make it onto my list. And of course, there is probably at least one or two on this list that might create debate in the comment section if necessary. But for now, here is my top 5 Southern American Civil War generals. After that, we'll follow my top 5 Northern American Civil War generals. So yeah, enjoy. Number 5, James Longstreet. Probably the finest corps commander of the war, and certainly, in my opinion, the finest corps commander in the South, specifically after the death of Stonewall Jackson. Old Gloomy Pete, as he was called, also known as Lee's old warhorse, was basically Robert E. Lee's most trusted and successful lieutenant from as soon as Lee got command of what would become the Army of Northern Virginia and until the final days of the war. Longstreet has often been denigrated in the years following the war as the man who sort of cost Lee the victory of Gettysburg, someone who did not fight with the full energy and dedication that the South deserved and demanded. However, most of these denigrations are basically from followers or proponents of the lost cause theory, primarily people like Jubal Early or his disciples. In reality, Longstreet was basically the man who ensured quite a few of the Southern victories. At Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, several other battles, it was his hammer blow or staunch defense as the anvil that allowed then Stonewall Jackson to either, portray the anvil or the hammer, and it was Longstreet that was always there for Lee, that Lee always knew he could count on. Longstreet probably managed to collect the finest staff officers of the entire war, and with that led his corps, the first corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, with spectacular skill and success. The reason he's not further up the list is that Longstreet did have mistakes. He was often somewhat passive-aggressively dedicated to following Lee's orders when he thought Lee was making a mistake, as if he wanted to a certain degree, let Lee fail on his own rather than try to do his utmost as at resolving the situation, such as, for instance, his insistence on following Lee's orders to the absolute letter of those orders on the second day of Gettysburg, where a bit of, shall we call it, initiative might well have allowed Hood to flank the Union Army and thus roll up the entire Union fishhook line from the south. But overall, Longstreet was in many ways the finest corps commander of the army, and anyone who puts Robert E. Lee as a top-ranked general must also praise James Longstreet as the tool that Lee most often used in order to truly ensure his victories. Number 4, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Probably the finest cavalry commander of the American Civil War. He led his cavalry division, cavalry corps, particularly out in the Western Theater, with a skill that are simply unmatched. In practically every single raid he did, he came off successful. It was his basic idea and basic raid that delayed Grant's capture of Vicksburg with perhaps almost 9 months after he raided a supply depot in late 1862. Also very successful as a light cavalry commander in its scouting and intelligence gathering role. He gave his superior commanders very efficient and precise information about the Union moves and forces, even if those top commanders didn't necessarily always then use that information to their best. Bedford Forrest was practically undefeated. There is a couple of battles where he can said to have been routed. These would or rather defeated, never routed is my point, but these were basically always against Northern forces of spectacular numerical superiority. So why isn't Bedford Forrest higher on the list? Well, first of all, like I said, he was primarily a raid cavalry commander. Those raids were very, very successful and they were very, very efficient, but in the end they didn't really change the overall strategic picture. When he was in command of the cavalry during pitched battles, his effectiveness lessened quite a bit as he was, and particularly his initiative and skill at maneuver was somewhat stifled by the congested concepts of the battleground and the moving infantry forces. Also, his inability to in any way get along with anyone he didn't particularly like, famously promised to murder Braxton Bragg and horsewhip Hood within an inch of his life, basically meant that his efficiency was lessened when dealing with other higher ranking commanders, thus not giving him the efficiency that he so managed to achieve on his own. Again, like with any other generals here, I'm not going to get into other particular parts, his connection with Ku Klux Klan, merely dealing with his military situation. And the military situation was that he was, Forrest, probably the finest cavalry commander of the war, but that he could have been a lot more effective if he had maintained that efficiency during pitched battles and not just when he took his own cavalry alone and rode out to raid the North, or rather, northern military encampments. Number 3, Joseph Johnston. Now, this is the first time where I think a certain degree of controversy might peek in that I put Johnston as high as I do. I do this, however, basically because I feel like no one would have been able to do better than Johnston. I fully admit that he is primarily famous for being beaten around Vicksburg, then being beaten at the Atlanta campaign, then being beaten at the Carolina campaign. However, in each case, he was up against incredibly numerical superior forces, as well as some of the finest generals the war offered in Ulysses Grant and William T. Sherman, and also his own relationship with his government were always rather, shall we say, finicky. He had never had a good relationship with Jefferson C. Davis, and he never forgave him for ranking him as low as he did in the beginning of the war. Johnston was the highest ranking U.S. Army officer to defect to the Confederacy, and he was really, really pissed that Johnston, in the original creation of Confederate State Army general officers, ranked him below such people as Albert Sidney Johnston and Robert E. Lee. However, Johnston did what he could. He never shied from his duty no matter what. He had a keen eye for strategy and realized that if he threw his small army that simply could not get the needed supplies and reinforcements to regain its former strength against first Grant and later Sherman, it would inevitably be worn down and destroyed by attrition, if nothing else. So he decided to trade space for time to basically keep his army intact while giving up land area in order to draw the war out to a degree that the North might get tired of it and negotiate a settled peace, or have Lincoln be defeated in the presidential election of 1864, and again lose the lead to a negotiated peace. This was not necessarily a thing that was super effective. He was up against some very good generals who could outmaneuver him because they had more men, more maneuverability, and in the end, Johnston's inability to bring them to at least some battles that could hold them and actually gave him the time he wanted speaks against him. However, again, in my opinion, no one could probably have done more, and to be more aggressive would, as we see when he was replaced around Atlanta by John Bell Hood, lead to utter disaster, since Hood managed in 3 or 4 months to basically utterly destroy the army that Johnston had so painstakingly tried to maintain. Johnston was also a general that his opponents basically said they never slept comfortably at night while facing Johnston because they so respected his skill. Sherman was jubilant when he was replaced by the far more aggressive Hood, because he knew here was his chance to basically strike a direct blow against the Southern armies on his own terms, because Hood would undoubtedly come out to attack him. So yeah, number 3, Johnston, for his ability, for his strategic thinking and ability to basically achieve his strategic goals in the face of overwhelming numerical superiority to his opponents, even if his strategy in the end did not pay off. Though, again, that was hardly his fault. Number 2, Robert E. Lee. And yes, I realize this is where a lot of students of the, or at least casual students of the American Civil War, is going to stop, look at me and think, has he hit his head hard? Why is he putting Lee as the number 2 Southern general? I do this for a couple of reasons. First of all, let me speak to Lee's advantages. He was utterly beloved by his people, by his officers. He was probably the single finest military tactician of his day, and alongside Johnston, he had sort of the same sort of strategic overlook, saying that especially after his invasion of Maryland in 1863 failed, he literally could not win the war by military means, and thus were forced to try to draw it out as much as possible in the hope that the North would lose its will to fight. However, Lee also, to a certain degree, had his flaws and mistakes. For once, he was the true Virginia gentleman. That also meant that he absolutely refused to give real direct orders to his subordinate commanders. When you had someone like Longstreet and Stonewall Jackson, who were really superior generals in their own rights, this could work very well. It also meant that when all his orders were basically couched as suggestions, when you had some lesser generals, they were perhaps not as eager to fully do what Lee wanted them to in a timely fashion. And Lee simply refused to then go in and overrule them and achieve the goal he has set. This was, in my opinion, basically what caused him to lose the Battle of Gettysburg, as several of his generals that simply did not do what he wanted them to, because they felt like he was only suggesting rather than ordering. Also, again, Lee was, as I said, a spectacular battlefield tactician. However, he also achieved quite a lot of his victories through very audacious tactics that, while very creative, skillfully thought out, and innovative, also meant high numbers of casualties and losses from his army, simply because the men who had to perform those tactics in the field did not simply have his feel and skill with any force, especially when it wasn't Longstreet, or especially after Jackson's death. For this reason, I place Lee as the best tactical commander of the Civil War, the third best overall commander of the Civil War, but only number 2 on the southern side. Yes, discuss this in comments and call me an idiot. Number 1, Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson, the finest military commander in the southern armies of the American Civil War, in my opinion. The man who, with a small but somewhat notable exception during the 7 days battles of the Peninsula Campaign, succeeded in every single battle he attempted. He won every battle he was part of. He was Lee's right arm. He was the man who, along with Longstreet, took Lee's overall strategic and tactical views and turned them into reality. He was the man who created the foot cavalry, basically marching more than 600 miles in like 20 or 30 days or something to appear in exactly the right place to annihilate whatever Union forces there was. He was the man who, wherever he was placed on the battlefield, just basically succeeded in routing the enemies in front of him. He was the man who held on with his forces at Second Bull Run for almost 2 whole days, skillfully maneuvering his men, moving them around and encouraging them to hold on, and thus absorbing the full pounding of the Army of Virginia until James Longstreet could move his part of Lee's army up, fall on the rear of the Army of Virginia, roll up the army, and utterly defeat them, thus giving the South the biggest battlefield victory they would get until Chancellorsville in 1863. Chancellorsville was probably also Jackson's masterpiece, where he skillfully maneuvered his forces around, fell on the weakest part of the Union lines, routed the Union lines, forced the Union line back in the biggest Union catastrophic defeat of the war. Sadly, of course, this was also where Jackson was subject to friendly fire when he was riding around at night with a small staff trying to figure out how to further attack and utterly destroy the Union forces the next day, and was sadly shot by one of his own pickets and died a few days later. Again, Jackson was Lee's right arm. That's what he called him. I have lost my right arm, he said when Jackson died. And after that, the Army of Northern Virginia, and in fact Lee himself, simply never achieved the success and skill that they had had before Jackson's death. There is every reason to believe that if Jackson had been in command of one half of Lee's army as he used to be at Gettysburg, rather than A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell, then Gettysburg would have been a Southern victory, and the war might very well have, if not ended there, at least taken a very different path in the East after July of 1863. Because of this, basically because the fact that this was the man who made Lee into the truly superior general he was in the beginning phases of the war, I call Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson the best Southern general of the American Civil War. Moving on to the North, we start with probably the single most controversial choice on this particular list. Number 5, Ambrose Burnside. Now, most people would think of Burnside and then think about the disaster at Fredericksburg and the Mud March and say, Sage, are you out of your mind? However, if one actually looks at Burnside's career, he was one of the most successful corps commanders, division and corps commanders, in fact, in the Eastern Theater, a place where, well, a lot of Union generals' careers ended. When he got command of the Army of the Potomac, it's true that he failed absolutely miserably. However, it is also worth noticing that he most certainly did not want command of the Army of the Potomac. He was ordered to take it 3 times, turning it down each time because he felt like he wasn't good enough and wouldn't be able to succeed. It wasn't, he had absolutely no enemies in the entire world except for one. He was actually known to be probably one of the nicest and most congenial persons in the American mid-19th century. There was only one person he actually disliked. That man was Joseph Hooker. And he was basically told the last time by President Lincoln, if you don't accept overall command of the Army of Potomac, I'm going to give it to Hooker, nya nya. So he did, and failed. Eventually Hooker then got control of the army, and, if possible, failed even worse. However, both of them were then to gain some manner of redemption by leading their corps into the west and doing some stuff there. Burnside basically clearing western Tennessee of Confederate forces and securing finally that state once and for all for the Union. In earlier battles during, for instance, the Bull Run campaigns and others in the East, he had again been a spectacularly successful corps commander. He always gave his best, and his best was quite good at that for whatever commanding general he had. And even McClellan had absolutely nothing bad to say about him, despite Burnside being the man who succeeded him as overall Eastern commander. So yeah, Ambrose Burnside, number 5 on my list of best Northern generals, simply due to his work as a division and corps commander, and my appreciation for his honesty in trying his best to get the best possible commander for the Army of the Potomac at a time when he basically knew that he would make a hash of things. I have a great deal of respect for that kind of person. Also, of course, as seen in the picture, his best beard of the war, winning combination of the thing that later became sideburns from his name, must also secure him high praise. Just look at it. Magnificent. Well, from this moment on, I don't think anyone on this list of Northern generals will surprise anyone. Perhaps only the placement of number 3 and number 4 might be certain surprise. Anyway, number 4, Little Philip Sheridan. Standing 5'6" or something, he was basically, as I said, Little Phil, a very small man. He rose to prominence fairly late in the war, really only getting a truly important and separate command during Grant's overland campaign in 1864, where he commanded the cavalry of the Army of the Potomac. Earlier, he had served as various commanding positions in the West, but had never really risen above the holy trifecta out there of Grant, Sherman, and McPherson. However, in the East, he then suddenly revealed his genius, leading his cavalry in the Battle of Yellow Tavern that defeated, destroyed, and killed Jeb Stuart, of all people. Then, of course, later leading an entire infantry army in the Shenandoah Valley, where he defeated Jubal Early repeatedly, and finally decisively driving the Confederates out of the Shenandoah Valley and thus depriving the South of their primary food productive areas of Virginia. Basically, in the end, with that campaign, dooming the Confederacy to final defeat by ensuring the fact that Lee simply did no longer possess the supplies needed to hold on at Richmond and Petersburg. So after that, Sheridan then became a commander in the West, of course. He is infamous or famous for leading a lot of the Indian War campaigns, but overall, in the Civil War, he was the first sort of overall Union cavalry commander who achieved any degree of success. He was also the first Union commander who achieved lasting success in the Shenandoah Valley, and he rose very, very quickly to become Grant's sort of leading man in the East. and in fact was the man whose relentless pursuit of Lee's retreating army finally brought them at bay at Appomattox to end, well, if not the war, then at least the primary battlefield operations. Number 3, George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, the defender of Chattanooga, and the victor of Nashville. Thomas was a general who served the entire campaign, or the entire war basically, in the West. He was known to a certain degree to be somewhat slow of movement, deliberate and meticulous, and in fact incurred a certain degree of distrust from Grant, who simply saw him as an overly cautious general. This is one of Grant's biggest, in my opinion, miscalculations about officers beneath his command, because while Thomas was indeed to a certain degree a bit less eager to rush into things and being very meticulous and precise in his planning, he was also basically successful in everything he did. When the Northern Army was routed at Chickamauga, Thomas was the man who decided, no, we're not just going to run, we're going to stop here where there is a decent place of defensive line and then hold on until we can withdraw in good order, which basically saved the entire Northern Army from disintegration and defeat in detail, thus basically saving the Northern Corps in the West that could otherwise have taken a severe setback if that particular army had been destroyed so shortly after Grant had taken Vicksburg. Following that campaign, he was his forces that led the victory at Chattanooga by their frontal attack up Missionary Ridge. It was him that led the primary forces of Sherman in his march to Atlanta, and after the march to Atlanta, it was him working together with General Schofield, that he otherwise didn't particularly like, who utterly smashed Hood's army at Franklin and Nashville, and thus rendered the Western Confederacy utterly dead at this particular point. Thomas was a man who basically succeeded at everything, just did it too slowly and cautiously to truly rank in the top 2 that he might otherwise very well have. Of course, the fact that he had 2 of the 4 best commanders of the Civil Wars and 2 of perhaps the 10 best commanders of the 19th century overall above him at any given time, to a certain degree, worked against him. But yes, George Thomas, 3rd best Union commander of the American Civil War. Supremely skilled in defense, supremely skilled in organization, lacking perhaps a tiny bit in offense. Number 2, William Tecumseh Sherman. Now, Sherman most certainly had his character flaws. He was an angry man from time to time. He was suffering from depression. Didn't particularly help when one of his children died from malaria after having visited his camp. Sherman was also quick to get into personal feuds with other Northern commanders, but he worked very, very successfully under Grant as a subordinate general, without any doubt the best subordinate general Grant had. The man who was for Grant what Stonewall Jackson and James Longstreet were for Lee, who cheerfully and enthusiastically obeyed Grant's overall designs even when he disagreed with them, and thus ensured their successes. A man who would work himself and his troops absolutely tirelessly in order to achieve battlefield successes, yet also looked after them in their every particular. When he himself got command, he initiated the masterful advance upon Atlanta that constantly outmaneuvered Joe Johnston without basically risking his own army in any way. His one mistake there was the frontal assault at Kennesaw, that he then, whether or not he ever would be, humble enough to admit had been a mistake, just basically proved that his original tactics was the right way to do it and continued to do so. His march to the sea was basically sort of the first real modern use of war on the American continent, namely the concept that it is important to remove the enemy's ability to wage war as much as to defeat their armies and conquer their territories. And while, of course, this has soured his reputation amongst Southerners and to a certain degree historians, Sherman in his march to the South were actually surprisingly civilized when compared to earlier and later commanders performing terror missions, and especially considering the fact that his own concept was, war is cruelty, you cannot refine it, so the best way is simply to finish it as quickly as possible with whatever means necessary in order to prevent prolonged suffering. However, for his strategic vision, his tactical skills, his ability to maneuver, his ability to attack, his ability to defend, Sherman is my second-ranking general of the Union during the Civil War and my fourth overall ranking general of the American Civil War. What he truly lacked, perhaps more than anything, was sort of overall political view of the war that prevented him from truly having the overall strategic masterly overview that someone like U.S. Grant possessed, and also missing what I'm going to get into very quickly, as you can probably all guess who will be number one, Grant's sort of calm and collectedness even during military setbacks. But yes, Sherman, number 2 on my list. Number 1, as everyone could have guessed from the end of my Sherman video, Ulysses S. Grant, Supreme Commander of the Union forces from mid-1864 until the end of the war, supremely efficient commander of Union forces in the West before that. I don't think I will court controversy by putting Grant as the top Union general. Where I am probably going to court a certain degree of controversy is I'm going to put Grant as the top general of the Civil War, period. Again, considering what I said about Stonewall and Lee and Sherman, that is definitely a high praise, but I truly think it is warranted. Grant was good in defense. He was good on attack. What he was really good at was not that he didn't make mistakes, because he made several mistakes, but Grant was really, really good at retrieving his mistakes, something that many military minds fail at, no matter how good they otherwise were. At Shiloh, take Shiloh, where he was surprised and in fact spent most of the entire first day of the Shiloh campaign having his army driven back, routed, beaten, battered, and bloodied. Grant, who had fallen off his horse and had the horse fall on him a couple of days earlier and was in magnificent pain, instead of panicking as most other generals would have and possibly retreating, losing most of the Western gains until then in the sort of time frame, basically just sat down, realized that the southern armies must be as exhausted as his own, absorbed some troops that came in from reinforcements, and then just made a plan that drove the South back, utterly defeated them the next day, routed them from most of Kentucky and most of Tennessee, and in fact could have ended the war in the West at that particular time had his then superior Henry Halleck moved with any degree of celerity to harry the Southern forces and just drive them down into Mississippi or possibly even Georgia or back across the Allegheny Mountains. Later, when his Vicksburg campaign was foundering, Grant again didn't give up. He just kept coming up with new plans, finally finding one that worked, supremely and superbly utilizing his subordinate commanders. In the Overland Campaign and the campaign in the East in 1864 and 1865, Grant was up against Lee, and it is then rumored that Grant's graph sort of failed him, and he basically just resorted to throwing superior forces at Lee in constantly constantly losing battles until attrition had finally taken its turn on the South. There is to a certain degree a truth in that. It is, however, worth noticing that at this point Grant worked in a weird situation where he didn't actually command his own army. He sort of gave commands to the army through its commander Meade. He also realized that yes, this is true, we can replace our forces, the South can't. And again, like Sherman believed, it was thus better to waste a few more men now by keeping up the pressure rather than pulling back and then again fighting a desultory back and forth campaign that might take years and in fact end the war. Grant was, in my opinion, the first real sort of modern general insofar as he was the one to realize that conquering cities or fighting great standoff battles would be much slower in leading to victory rather than utterly defeating and destroying the enemy's armies and their abilities to make war. For his tactical, what you can say about Grant is that he lost several battles, but he never lost a campaign, and he won the war, also probably becoming the one general that, well, most of his subordinates truly respected, a feat that practically no other Northern general did. For his strategic, tactical overview, his calmness, and his general skill, I rank Ulysses S. Grant as the top Northern general in the American Civil War, and in fact, the top general of the American Civil War. Now start the pillorying. Well, that was it. My first sort of, in some ways, perhaps controversial videos. 10 American generals ranked by a Dane in the American Civil War, who is even ranking them perhaps in a way that most people would disagree with. However, these are my list. I hope you enjoyed the video. I promised I would name drop a few generals that didn't make it onto the list. They would certainly have made it onto any top 10, and some of them could possibly be said to possibly have been at least capable of reaching a top 5, but I left these out. So in no particular order, here is extra respect to people like A.P. Hill, D.H. Hill, George Gordon Meade, James McPherson, Winfield Scott Hancock, and several others on the northern and southern side. But these particular 5 would have been among my next. One could also, of course, have mentioned a Beauregard and several others. But yeah, these are the ones I just wanted to name drop here. Anyway, this was my video. I hope you enjoyed it. I will eventually return to the American Civil War one again in the future, because it is one of my great and important interests. But until then, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.